So thanks to everybody for logging in today, and thank you very much to Barry O'Reilly for coming to give us this CPD. So Barry is based with the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage, and he's going to speak to us today about vernacular architecture.
Right. Okay, well, welcome everybody. We're just going to talk about the relevance of vernacular to archaeologists. The term vernacular always causes a certain amount of excitement because it's a term that can be used in relation to language, but it's increasingly used to relate to things like traditional music and, of course, traditional architecture. So it's a handy code. The term traditional has been sort of hijacked by general building conservation community to mean pre-modern buildings and materials and methods. So vernacular is just a way of putting clear blue water between a certain aspect of the cultural heritage and the rest of it. The photograph that's on the screen here is of the innards of a vernacular building in County Offaly. It is an outbuilding with a very roughly made timber roof with thatch over it, and you can see also mud walling. So this is the essence really of vernacular building. So what is vernacular? It's traditional and informal, local but global, underrated and understudied, and it's eco-friendly without even trying. If we want to be sustainable, I would suggest that the vernacular offers so many lessons and clues for how to achieve that. And this is a statement from Deacon Moss Charter on the Built Vernacular Heritage, and I've just taken out some selected phrases which I think embody what we're talking about here. So the fundamental expression of the culture of a community and of the world's cultural diversity. It's the traditional and natural way by which communities house themselves, continuous adaptation, etc., survival threatened worldwide by forces of economic, cultural, and architectural homogenization. I think we've all seen this on our travels around the world. The key, though, is not to preserve stuff in aspic, but to recognize that it does change over time. But change can sometimes be very, very sudden. In modern times, change can be quite harsh and quite abrupt, and it can actually cause a fracturing in cultural traditions. So this is something that really needs to be countered. And these two illustrations on the right here are of they're of a farmstead in County Kilkenny on the top right there, which shows quite a few of the materials that you get associated with vernacular. Of course, the work of the blacksmith, the mason, the thatcher, all exemplified in this photograph. And then a kitchen interior of a vernacular house in County Offaly. All of these things they have a quirkiness about them. No two vernacular buildings will be exactly alike. You won't find a straight angle in anything. So they're one-offs. So this chap here in front of a drawing board is the sort of fellow you won't see hanging around a vernacular building and wouldn't have seen hanging around a vernacular building. If there's a sniff of a drawing board involved in a building or a feature, you're really not talking about vernacular architecture. So things like labourers' cottages are not vernacular architecture. They may have absorbed some elements of vernacular, but they're inherently not vernacular because they came off a drawing board. And it's personally, I think it's just as simple as that. Why is vernacular relevant to the archaeologist? Well, because archaeologists have been digging vernacular stuff for centuries. So this is Mount Sandal, County Derry, and you're talking about a vernacular building, the first decently recognised vernacular building in Ireland, dating back to the 8th millennium BC. If we find anything earlier than that, it'll also be vernacular. Vernacular started from the very first time that humans started to build shelter for themselves and to use building materials, to relatively recently. There's sort of a notional cut-off about sort of 1900 when you start getting industrialized components, architects, engineers, planners, authorities of various sorts getting involved in building. Then on a sort of sliding scale, depending on where you are in the world and at what time. the vernacular is eclipsed by, if you like, industrialized building technology. Corstown, County Derry, classic example of an early vernacular settlement. Wood Quay in Dublin, again, all vernacular materials, wattle, everything, all totally familiar in existing vernacular architecture. A house in Drogheda, one of the last timber houses upstanding in Ireland. And then we're all familiar with the houses from the plantation maps. This is Monaghan Fort. And there's more recent vernacular. So Eve Campbell's excavations there on Achill, which was exploring and elucidating some of the more recent vernacular buildings of probably 18th century, 19th century date. Date is completely irrelevant, really, when it comes to vernacular. People often ask me, well, you know, what date are vernacular buildings? And I say, well, how long is a piece of string? Because the first ones are, as I said earlier, Mount Sandal, and the most recent ones, you know, relatively recently. I'm aware of a small hut that was built for a man whose roof had collapsed in North County Dublin in the 1950s. Locals made him a hut made out of grass sods. So vernacular is still being created at a relatively late stage here and there. This is Mick O'Drumma in Tiptown, and he was excavating the site of a vernacular house, a two-room vernacular house. Then we have buildings, echoes of early vernacular buildings, particularly in some of Northern Ireland counties, Fermanagh, Armagh, parts of Antrim, where you get crook-built structures. And crook-built structures are essentially a form where the main load-bearing elements, both roofing and walling, are contained within substantial timber structures, which start from or just above floor level and go right up to the ridge. The dwelling house on the bottom here, which is very unprepossessing, is a crook-built house. And this is one of the key features of vernacular buildings. You really don't know what level of interest a vernacular building has until you have a good look at its innards and at its interior. You just can't say very much from the outside. That is what I'd say. If you have a labourer's cottage of, say, 1880, all labourer's cottages of that type will be or should be exactly the same. You will not find that with vernacular buildings. And I think this is relevant to archaeologists, because when you turn up on a site, you really don't know what you're going to find. It's very much like that with the vernacular. This is a building from County Wexford, a house in County Wexford, with a wall oven. You can see that square of masonry in the corner there in the middle of the photograph is a wall oven with a domed brick roof in the interior. And you can find them in various parts of the country. They're associated more with, you know, strong Anglo-Norman areas, plantation areas, and so on. And then here's an example. This is from Lismaclusky in County Antrim, and it's in the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum. And you can see the wall oven is indicated there. And then also settlements can be early. This is Booley Glass in County Kilkenny, and you can see the S-shaped fields, which are very likely early. And the green, the long sort of triangular green there between those fields and the dwelling houses was cut through probably in the 18th century. But the dwelling houses and yards associated with them naturally terminated these long fields. So you're there getting a palimpsest. And there's no reason why those courtyards, at least in their earliest phase, couldn't be coterminous with the fields. I just see this as being an example of a very likely late medieval settlement. Then vernacular comes in all sorts of different scales. You could go, there's also the whole area of intangibility. So the skills used in building vernacular buildings, the living in vernacular buildings, the use of tradition, the passing on of traditions, of folklore, of tales and so on, is something which is intangible, which you can't really picture on a presentation like this. But the scales go from small objects to hearths and hearth furniture, to old dwelling houses and outbuildings and yards, to the level of settlements, and also to the scale of whole landscapes. So this is part of the Iron Islands, and I see the three Iron Islands essentially as large vernacular landscapes. You know, essentially, what else are they? They are large vernacular landscapes. You get landscapes which are as thoroughly vernacular in other parts of the country as well. So the most common building materials in vernacular, certainly as it survives, are stone and mud. Now, the term mud includes the whole gamut. I used to use the whole gamut of earth, clay, and so on. Very commonly, people who live in clay houses just use the term mud. They call them mud houses. There's no stigma associated with the term mud. The term cob is not a term we use in Ireland, so I would urge people not to use the term cob necessarily. Rough stone, field stone, the incorporation of boulders is very common. Ballynockin, County Wicklow, quarry cutter settlement, much finer stonework, unusually fine, good cut stone chimneys and so on. And this is how field stone and even quarry stone was retrieved. It was the making of small holes in the surface of the rock, and then you tap in with a chisel, and you eventually put in feathers, and you eventually end up splitting the whole rock and then cleaving it off. And in upland areas where there's lots of granite, you will see stones, and whether loose stones or stone which is actually in the ground with the marks of quarrying. So plug and feathers is what this is called. And then stone could be used in roofs. This is in County Clare, which is known for its flag roofs, its stone flag roofs, which is an important part of the tradition. Not all vernacular roofs are thatch. We can get a bit hung up on thatch, but there are many other different roof types. Mud walling comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. This is County Fermanagh, but this is walls made out of really blocks of clay or mud, and you find it in Monaghan. You also find it in various other forms around the country. I know, for example, in Tipperary, there are fist-sized lumps in walls, and I call that clay lump rather than clay block. And then this is an example from recent times in West Africa of two lads there mixing up mud to make mud walls. There's a fantastic tradition of mud building in very many countries. You have it in Yemen, of course, which is benighted by civil war and so on. And it has some of the most interesting and largest vernacular buildings on the planet. The mosque in Jenne in Mali is entirely made of mud, and so forth. So mud building is part of a very noble and very far-flung global tradition. I had this slide already. Organic materials, timbers from the hedgerow or from the bog oak is quite common. Timbers that have floated in as part of flotsam from shipwrecks was gladly taken up and used in vernacular buildings, particularly on the coasts. Sawn timbering appears a bit later. I think probably most of it would be late 19th century in date. But you can see that even at that stage in this, these two slides actually from County Offaly. The top one is from East Offaly, where the method of thatching is to put a layer of thatch onto an underlayer of thatch. In West Offaly and in much of the western half and upland Ireland, you will get the upper layer of thatch secured to an underlayer which is made from grass sod or the material from the top of a bog. So it's sort of a thickish material which acts as a good anchor for rooting that upper material. Houses made from peat. This is McGilligan County Derry. You get also houses made from grass sod, but none of this stuff would really survive. Grass sod, peat buildings would be probably hard enough to recognize archaeologically in the landscape, but they are there. Wicker is, now I mentioned already Woodkey and similar Hiberno Norse buildings had a very substantial degree of wattlework forming their walls and so on. And wattlework is an essential ingredient of very many vernacular buildings, often in chimney hoods. Here we're looking up a chimney of a house in County Wicklow. But they were also present. Wicker was also present in partitions and sometimes in the upper the upper gables of buildings, particularly internal gables. Very, very versatile material, very important in vernacular architecture, and one that links us very evidently to archaeological time and archaeological expression of buildings and so on. And this is a picture from the underside of a house in County Waterford, where you have straw very, very carefully laid side by side to make a very nice ceiling. This is a feature of parts of Cork, Wexford, Waterford, and I think a few other counties, but very particularly those counties. Vernacular house appears in two main forms. Lobby entry, where you have a little lobby formed by a wall to one side of the hearth, which, if you like, sort of screens the hearth from the doorway. And this is an example of the sort of feature when you look in the door. This is what you see: a little wall, often with a window in it, so that admits light into the hearth area, and at the same time the wall prevents drafts. So it's quite a clever little thing, probably introduced during the 17th century by British settlers. Direct entry house, lobby entry houses are very much a feature of the eastern half of the country, of the island of Ireland. Direct entry is more a feature of the western half of the country, of the island, and of upland areas. And you don't have that little wall preventing access, if you like, directly into the interior. So it's called direct entry. And then the hearth is off to one side. A feature of direct entry houses in northwestern counties, from Antrim actually, all the way down to about Galway, is a bed out shot. In this illustration, this map, it's called N for niche, but it could just easily be O for outshot. And the outshot is where you accommodate a bed to one side of the fireplace or the kitchen hearth by backing the wall out a little bit to provide that extra bit of space. This links us to Scotland. So Orkneys and so on, and the Hebrides have lots of examples of bed out shots. So we're not on our own in these matters. And then also a feature of some early direct entry houses was the idea of the longhouse. The longhouse is not just a house that's long, as you would get in the property press and some architectural publications, but a longhouse is one where the family, the humans, were occupied one end of the house, and the milk cattle accommodated or were accommodated in the far end. So this is again something with an international distribution. You'll find these. In fact, you find forms of building like this really throughout the world, where humans and animals occupied the same space. Now, settlement forms, which is very dear to my heart, it's what I did my doctoral research on in the last decade or so. And there are many, many different forms. They're very, very interesting. In fact, there's probably more variability in settlement forms than there is in house types, and certainly than there is in house types in Ireland. The vernacular settlements generally, not just in Ireland, but in many, many countries, divide into row settlements and agglomerations. And the top one there is a row settlement, just literally sort of a line of houses or farmyards. It doesn't have to be a straight line. It can be sort of a rough line. And they're often on roads which have now been bypassed, as in this illustration there at the top left. Menlo, County Galway, one of the largest agglomerations in Ireland. This is both of these are the first edition maps. And even though the Menlo settlement looks like it's higgledy-piggledy and like a whole lot of buildings dropped out of the back of a jumbo jet, there's actually an internal logic to this settlement with multi-layered geographies. Then there are also, in terms of row types, Kilkee in County Kilkenny is one where you have courtyards, cheap by jowl, like a bit rather like chess squares. Sometimes they're extremely orthogonal one to the next. Then the bottom slide is Smerrick in County Kerry, which is what I would call a parallel agglomeration. These ranges of buildings almost exactly parallel to each other, gables to the wind. This is something you also find in north of Scotland and in Brittany. So again, international connections. Then you do get other forms which are a little quirkier, maybe a little more local. Glenban in County Tip has a very strong definition to its edges. This is most unusual. Smerrick actually, come to think of it now, is also quite firmly bounded by, as you can see, by boundaries. But it's a bit unusual to get very rectangular forms. So Glenban is one of these with quite a strong rectangular form. It really doesn't feel terribly vernacular, but it is. Listrolan then in the Welsh Mountains in Kilkenny has what I would call an agglomerative settlement. So it's I'm throwing lots of vocabulary around here, but you'll be punch drunk after this. But it has courtyards which look like they want to get together and form an agglomeration of courtyards, but they haven't quite got there. And these courtyard settlements in Kilkenny, for example, have a very strong distribution in the south, and there's hardly any examples in the nearest parts of adjoining counties. So there's an interesting puzzle to be solved there. Landscape change obviously is an important thing. I hinted at it in the illustration which showed a line of farmyards with a bypassing straight road. And this is Tory Island, showing a Rundale setup. So this is a situation where you had a settlement at the centre. Sometimes the word clachan is used for vernacular settlements, particularly in the west. It's not a great term really. I much prefer the term hamlet or even vernacular settlement, and that way we don't get hung up and sort of backed into corners with regards to lifestyles or landholding regimes and so on. In this, you can see that fields are coming radially out of the settlement. What you had there was, you had a settlement at the centre of a little pasture setup, sorry, a tillage setup surrounded by more open pasture for animals, and then the resources of the sea in terms of seaweed and so on could be availed upon. In many cases, there was an element of transhumance or upland pasture associated with Rundale. And then through the 19th century or even before, there was an attempt made to regularize these situations. What you had very frequently with Rundale settlement is, and indeed settlement in general, I mean, if you think of medieval fields, initially there would have been a patchwork of very small fields, often later agglomerated and regularized into much larger fields. This example from Mayo shows the dispersal of the small field strips in very diverse ownership into much larger holdings, which were seen to be more economically advantageous, practical, and so on. This process was engaged with gusto for a period of time, and then sort of ran out of fizz at a certain stage. So we still have, thankfully, quite a few vernacular settlements. There was a real attempt made to eradicate them in large parts of the West, Roscommon, Mayo, and so on. But we still have large numbers, and they're something which is, very much underexplored. These are field systems on Clare Island. You can see that there are bands of earlier tillage which have been overlaid by more regular fields, and this is the way things tend to go. So the extent to which we should be recording these and or protecting them is another day's work. Then there are many examples of settlements on the first edition map, which by today have been almost completely erased. You can see a different coloration there on the site of the original settlement. But what is this if not an archaeological site? It'd be pistols at dawn now to if somebody were to argue over this, because I think it's a complete no-brainer. This sort of scenario is straightforwardly an archaeological scenario. Only archaeology can tease apart what a place like Ballina Park looked like. We have sensitive material and so on, but you're only getting under the skin of settlement really when you get down and dirty with your trowel. Now, I've already touched in one of the earlier slides on the idea of the vernacular landscape. The vernacular landscape is something which is not talked about very much. There is a book called The Vernacular Landscape by an American author, but it is, it doesn't really, it wouldn't relate to Ireland very well, is the way I put it. But I suppose vernacular landscapes they're informal landscapes. They're unofficial landscapes. These are landscapes of small lanes, of irregular fields, of vernacular buildings, features like wells and so on, that they're not conforming to any particular order or style. That's the thing. There is no such thing as a vernacular style. I've seen some books mentioning, this building is of vernacular style. There's no such thing as vernacular style. It's either vernacular or it's not. Vernacular mindset would be a better way, or vernacular ideology would be a better way, but not style. This is a sweat house in County Leitrim here in the top left. It's part of the archaeological record. They tend to get put into the archaeological inventories, but it's also very, very clearly a vernacular site. It's something which is a communal amenity or facility. Then, of course, now we're getting straight into the area of the intangible, with physical manifestations as well. So we have St. Bridget's Well in Liscannor on the left, and we have Care Island on the right, showing devotion and piety on the part of ordinary people, and in places which are partly shaped by humans, but also very much linked into the natural world. And this juxtaposition of the human and the natural, the physical and the non-physical, and the religious and the supernatural, is something which people have explored frequently in Ireland, and it's there and very very tangible, really, for something which is intangible. It can be very tangible. An example then is this site in County Kerry, and not too far from Kenmare, and it's a boulder with little stone basins in it, with stones in it. It's been called a couple of things, like I think the lumps of butter, the butter lumps, the butter stones. The petrified dairy is another one. And the story anyway is that Saint Fiachna, who's the local saint, had this woman in charge of his cattle, and what she was doing was secretly selling his butter at the market. Didn't like that very much, and then he, anyway, that's just one. We'll hold that for a moment. Then there was also another story about a woman with no cows of her own who would set charms to basically steal what they call the milk profit from other people. The saint didn't like this very much. He called to the house unannounced, and she had 7 rolls of butter on a big timber board, and to express his annoyance, he turned the whole thing into stone. So the butter lumps became stones, and the butter board became a lump of rock, a lump of stone. And then she tried to get away from him, but he turned her into stone. And here's her image here on the right, the little illustration there in black and white. So this notion of the tangible and the intangible, the archaeological and the folkloric, hitting the landscape, all of this creates a feature like this. So this is not just simply a boulder with a few stones in it, very clearly. It's in the archaeological inventories as a bull-on stone, but I think this is rather more than a bull-on stone. This is something which is transcends that very simple description. Then the subject of nature and so on. This is the Mile Bush, not far from Rosbercon in County Kilkenny, and it's just literally a tree in the middle of a road junction. It's not in the first edition map, curiously, and not surprisingly, it's not on the current edition Ordnance Survey maps. Current edition Ordnance Survey maps don't really serve us very well. They're not very much use for cultural landscape, I would contend. But this anyway is the Mile Bush. So bushes, named bushes, holy bushes, all comes under the heading of vernacular, to my mind. Now we're on the last slide now, and I just want to touch on recording in a very general way. Obviously, measuring vernacular features, buildings, ditches, whatever, is de rigueur, and we should do it. There isn't enough recording done, and there's lots of questions about what is the nature of large aspects of our buildings. What are the origins of the vernacular house? Have we recognized all the types of house, for example? And we won't get to answer that question until we do a lot more research, particularly in the field. So plan sections, elevations, details, and I'm talking in terms of details, I'm talking heart areas, heart canopies, that sort of thing. The heart is by far the most important element in any vernacular house. You lose the heart of the house and you've lost the house. You know, H-E-A-R-T-H equals H-E-A-R-T when it comes to vernacular. Photography, all archaeologists are very used to this. Interior, exterior details, setting. Setting is really important. Buildings don't exist in a vacuum. They're tied in with landscape, they're tied in with field systems, with gates, with yards, roads, you name it. I mentioned the importance of the heart area, but also the roof structure and covering. If you're dealing with a particularly attached roof, there's a whole science to recording attached roof. It's not for the faint-hearted. Religion and magic, as it features in, for example, horseshoes and things like horse skulls and pots on their floors. You may have the house leek, semper vivum. It could be in thatch or it could be in a wall. It was regarded as warding off fire. So there's lots of things like that. Obviously, holy pictures and other elements of piety from whatever religious denomination. The environs is an obvious one. Talking to people. This is one of my interviewees in County Donegal. I interviewed people in relation to my doctoral work. I couldn't help myself. I just had to do it. It was just so important. You can get caught up in maps, you can get caught up in census returns and so on, but actually talking to people, real people, asking them about their own place yields huge amount of valuable information and context. You just can't work in recording vernacular without talking to people. And then I mentioned some elements of research. Ordnance survey maps are usually the starting place. So the first edition for a lot of the country, for a lot of the West, it's later editions. The landscape in parts of Donegal and Galway and Mayo changed radically from the time of the first edition to the years around 1900. And I'd also say, just as a sort of a parting shot, there's lots of things which purport to be works on vernacular. There's the books which have cottage in the title. Some of them are good, but most of them are not great. And I would urge people to use authoritative sources. I've seen so often reports done which cite sources that I wouldn't be crazy about, and that don't cite much better sources. So as part of this, if people wish, I could supply a short reading list which will direct people towards those sources which I think are most useful and most authoritative. So we leave it at that, lads, and thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Barry. That was fantastic. So if anybody has a question, I can unmute you if you'd like. Just let me know in the chat, and I can let you ask that question. I'll start though. Mud-walled houses. What is the point of no return in terms of their dereliction after the roof is gone? It breaks my heart every time I see the old Tara post office. It's gone,
I wouldn't mind, but myself and who was it? Pat Wallace actually, and somebody else, it might have been Con Manning or somebody, went and we measured it up actually. We measured up ground plan and first floor plan, and oh yeah, it's just it is difficult. Often the lines of communication, or who owns it, what can you do, to what extent can you intervene in these situations. There can be situations, particularly with vernacular buildings, where you're just tearing your hair out. What can we do to save this place? And just so often, the best you can do is record it. It's not great, or what I've advocated from time to time with buildings which, let's say, have a thatched roof, it's ruinous. We know it's not going to be repaired in geological time. Maybe the best thing to do is put corrugated over it. At least it'll protect it, So there's nothing worse than, because if you lose the roof, you usually lose the building. Walls will start to come down and so on. So, but clay walls will return to the earth from which they came eventually, if left to their own devices. But there are examples of clay wall buildings where somebody tried to demolish a particular clay wall building with a JCB, and all they did was push the thing off its foundation. And they needed to get two, I think it's the case in the north of Ireland, they had to get two JCBs working from two directions to eventually make it come to heel, you know. So mud buildings are very thick walls. I mean, they usually um, start around 700 mils thick. They can go up to well over a meter. So they're quite stout and will put up with a lot of abuse and weathering and all the rest of it. But you do need to protect them, keep the roof on them, you know. But so we need recording on a large scale. This was looked for back in 1945, and it's never happened. It was in JRSCI for 1945. It never happened, and so we are losing buildings. I'm not sure, are we losing them any faster than we were, say, 20 years ago. I couldn't say, but yeah, it's the perennial problem. You know, what can we do? Vast majority of buildings are not listed, even if they were listed. You know, you don't have the freedom to act necessarily. So
Yeah.
almost got to that answer, but
Yeah. Yeah,
no.
no, it's just a shame to see them go to demolition, but yeah, it's just a matter of how long do you have to save them, you know?
Mm,
We have a few comments here. Cara Ward, thanks very much, very interesting. I would like to get a copy of the reading list, please.
fine,
Yeah, maybe if you want to send me the reading list, we could put it up
I
on the
will.
website, maybe, or I
Sure.
could send it out to
Yeah,
everyone.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Edlyn, thanks very much for a great talk. Emmett would like to ask a question. I'll unmute you, Emmett.
Hi,
No.
Yolanda. Hi, Barry. Thanks.
Okay.
Barry, I have a question just following on your point about protecting the settlement clusters, particularly the sites of them where they're,
Yeah,
essentially leveled. And I appreciate you're not necessarily maybe you're not speaking in an official capacity. So I'll ask you this question in a personal capacity. So would
yeah.
you favor the idea of a kind of a rolling, so like in the Archaeological Resources Protection Act in the United States, it's a rolling 100 years. And we have
Mm,
the same for Rex here. Would you favor something like a rolling 150 years? If something was at
mm,
least 150 years old, then it had the potential to be, because archaeology has been created every day.
yeah.
That's the way we should protect these sites. That we sort of once they reach a certain age, they're protected.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. I know I think is it in Sweden they have a cut off. I think it's something like 75 years or something. If say furniture or something is 75 years old or older, it's regarded as almost like a state asset, something like that. I think they have. I seem to remember something. But we had a situation not too long ago when 1600 was cut off. Now, generally, 1700 is a cut off, and there is, there is some discussion about that at the moment. I'll just say I leave it at that. But I don't think. I mean, you could like something that comes very immediately to mind, like you said, 100 or 150 years. The Great Famine, the first edition maps. You know, what happened after the first edition was, frequently a major change in the socio-cultural situation in the country, with, often large-scale land reorganization and so on, and in large parts of the West, massive change. So it is a sort of watershed, and some people do favour the first edition Ordnance Survey as a sort of a cut-off in these matters. I'm not sure about the sort of rolling protection thing, because I sort of, even though I work for the National Inventory and it's all about, national, regional, local, whatever, international, national, regional, local, record only, I always have I always entertain doubts about all of this, like in ways like when you list things on the RPS or even in the SMR and the RMP, you know, you're sort of presuming that they're at risk of harm, I would really much rather a situation where we engage with people and that the message right across the board would be, look, lads, don't be knocking things, hang on to things. Don't be throwing out old furniture. I would rather we had a situation where we're we were that civilized that we wouldn't just go and pull down a forged made gate and replace it with one of these tubular things that doesn't last a wet Tuesday, you know. So you could probably have to have both systems. But I do, I've been working on this national strategy for vernacular, which is on the verge of being published, and we're taking a very broad view of the whole thing, and we're not necessarily pushing, for every second vernacular building or feature to be protected legally, because it's just, well, the task would be enormous. That'd be one. And the second thing is, do we really want to go down that route? That's the other thing. But if we provide all of the infrastructure in place, and that means people at local authority level, state level, all the various conservation people that you need, and I'm talking about upskilling small builders. Have you a plentiful supply of well-trained traditional thatchers? Have you got all the people who can fix mud walls? If you have all of these skills in place, and then a decent regime of grant assistance and ready advice, well then, I think in many ways that's the way we should go. But there will be situations where we want to legally protect something. So I'm for me, the jury is out on whether your suggestion, Emmett, is necessarily the way that we should go. But there's a discussion to be had on it, certainly.
Okay, so we leave it at that then.
Yeah.
Thanks again very much, Barry, and thanks to everyone who dialed in today. Can I just say as well that the board of the IAI are seeking a new board member. So if anyone is interested, come forward and you can email the chair at iai.ie, because it'd be great if we could have a full board going.